as well. 15 seconds, wonderful. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you have had a nice lunch break and that you're ready to discuss maritime security in the Arctic. My name is Petra Cicvaric, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the 7th panel of the Atlantic Forum Spring Conference. So when discussing climate change, it is really important to include the conversations on Arctic. Namely, Arctic is warming 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the world, which potentially leads to an easier access to Arctic region, increased maritime activity, resource extraction, and threat to the human security of Arctic population. Consequently, in recent years, the international community has witnessed increased militarization of the Arctic and rising Russian ability to pose a threat to sea lines of communication, together with other non-Arctic states, for example China, expressing their economic interest within the region. Moreover, it is observable that commercial fishing has moved further north, threatening the livelihood of the indigenous coastal communities. Indeed, these and many more trends are outside of NATO's control directly, but might have an impact on Allied perception and ultimately even behavior, since they are making operational environment much more challenging and complex. So taking all of these trends and their implications into consideration, this panel will focus on potential challenges and threats to maritime security in the ice-free Arctic, by looking into the key factors behind the transformation of maritime economy, sea lines of communication, and resources in the Arctic. Moreover, it will tackle the evolving geopolitical environment and shifting balance of power within the region, their impacts on international order at sea, in the High North, while stressing the evolving significance of naval domain for NATO, especially in context of combating hybrid warfare, even some say hybrid naval warfare. Therefore, this panel will discuss 6 broad but interlinked issues that will influence the future international order at sea, particularly in the High North. So a balance between the maritime and the continental domains, balance between great power rivalry and cooperation, which seems to be that rivalry is more prominent today than previously in a post-Cold War era, the contest between access and denial, the operational balance preparing, building and training for war fighting and operations other than war, managing in disorder security challenges that were often transcend territorial waters and national boundaries, balance between safeguarding national interests and contributing to collective efforts to preserve the international order at sea. Grove in 1990 has actually said that sea power means different things to different people. It can be an almost mystical concept, a magic formula to be muttered in awestruck tones to scare away evil spirits, such as defense ministers with non-naval priorities and Air Force officers with alternate means and offer of providing a state's military power on or across the oceans. Irrespective of what we think and what significance do we put on sea power, the situation in the maritime domain faces an uncountable number of complex challenges, ranging from piracy, drug trafficking, search and rescue operations, etc. And all of them are taking place over a vast open oceans within which navies also project their naval power, and Arctic is not an exception anymore. Today, approximately 60% of the world's population lives within 100 kilometers of the ocean, and 90% of global trade is carried by volume by ships. In this context, if we translate this to the Arctic region, it is thought to contain approximately 90 billion barrels of oil, 47 trillion cubic meters of natural gas, out of which Russian maritime zone is estimated to possess the largest share, 48 billion barrels of oil and 43 trillion cubic meters of natural gas. As you know, Arctic region is predominantly an ocean with 3 gates: the Davis Strait, the Bering Strait, and the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom Gap. This region is regulated by maritime laws and is strongly influenced by the sovereign rights of regional powers. Russian northern coast is also encompassing the Northern Sea Route that is being presented as a potential shortcut between Europe and Asia. This shipping lane stretches from North Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. As a result of the climate change, this passage is marking a yearly increase in the voyages, which ultimately benefit Russian economic interest, considering that the route is passing through its territorial waters and EEZ. Therefore, this region is hugely governed by the role of coastal states, Unlike Antarctica, Arctic does not have a single comprehensive treaty, but is codified by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. States' continental shelves regulate their maritime zones, and they entitle them to up to 200 nautical miles for the exclusive economic zones. Within these zones, the states are entitled to have a full freedom of the exploration and exploitation. However, these zones can be extended if there is a scientifically proven geological continuity of the continental shelf. This ability of extending the zone is posing issues in this relatively peaceful and cooperative region, since those requests sometimes can be overlapping, and that complicates the free passage of ships in the area and borders of state sovereignty. Over the past years, we have witnessed the heating up of the Arctic region, and for decades now, we're seeing that there is an evolutive trajectory to increasing it further. As a result, the Arctic has increasingly been moving away from the international strategic periphery, raising the question of the degree to which the Arctic should be considered an international security concern as opposed to a regional one. Security in the Arctic has traditionally been discussed within non-military frameworks. The most pressing issue has been the region's susceptibility to climate change, including the erosion of polar ice and altered weather conditions, with the associated impact on local level of socioeconomic affairs and indigenous people. In order to better understand these complex security challenges that are emerging in the Arctic and debate about the potential conflict in the region, it is important to have a look at the region from all perspectives, not just the economic. So in order to explore it in a holistic manner, I have the great pleasure to welcome the following speakers. Dr. Mark Lantangi is an associate professor of political science at the University of Tromsø, the Art University of Norway, specializing in the foreign domestic politics of China, as well as the international relations and non-traditional security of Northeast Asia, Russian Far East, Europe, and polar regions. In January 2020, he co-edited the Routledge Handbook of Arctic Security, which was the first such compilation volume to specifically address the expanding areas of Arctic security studies. Dr. Lantangi has previously taught and researched in Canada, China, New Zealand and Norway, and the United Kingdom, and have taught courses in international relations and cooperative politics. Ms. Abby Tingstedt is Associate Director of the Engineering and Applied Sciences Department and a Senior Physical Scientist at the Rand Corporation. Her research focuses on issues related to strategy and planning in defense and homeland security and for the environment. Some examples of recent research include examining different pathways for Arctic development, analyzing software update needs for electromagnetic spectrum operations, and developing methods for foresight activities. She also gave a testimony in September 2019 before the House Homeland Security Committee, Subcommittee on Transportation and Maritime Security in the Arctic. And that's where her research is focusing: Arctic region, military strategy, US Coast Guard, and many, many others. And last but not least, Mr. Filip Walczak is the NATO Youth Delegate of Poland, an Atlantic Forum patron, and a lawyer graduating from the Faculty of Law and Administration in the University of Gdańsk. He is also a member of Polish Geopolitical Society. His main fields of interest include human rights law, maritime security, as well as youth engagement in NATO. Apart from his academic and professional activities, he's an avid NGO activist supporting young people and his local community with legal knowledge as an experienced member of the Independent Students Association. Lastly, since it's a period of national mourning in the United Kingdom, following Friday's announcement of the death of His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, Lieutenant Colonel James Livlin, a deputy political advisor at Markham, was not able to join us on screen, but has generously provided us with his opening remarks that I will just give a read through for all of us. Firstly, on behalf of Vice Admiral Keith Blount, Commander Markham, please could the panel and your audience accept our sincere apologies for not being present on screen today. It is a period of national mourning in the United Kingdom following Friday's announcement of the death of His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. I must state that these comments are opinion expressed in a personal capacity. They are not intended to represent or reflect NATO policy. Nonetheless, it is a great privilege to have the opportunity to participate in this forum, and now for the following remarks to open the panel discussion. The maritime domain has always been important to NATO. As a transatlantic alliance during the Cold War, the need to protect sea lines of communication in order to potentially reinforce the defense of Europe was paramount. The sea offers a domain from where navies can support operations on land, in the air, and space, collect intelligence, and project power to deter. This deterrent effect can be achieved overtly as a show of force or covertly with a difficult-to-detect subsurface strategic nuclear capability. This year will mark the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Soviet Union. Since then, NATO has continually adapted to changing environments, be it political, military, or with the mounting impact of climate change, physical. From the maritime perspective, 3 decades has seen a shift towards broader maritime security issues such as terrorism, piracy, illegal migration, and transnational crime, as well as the recent return to competition with Russia. NATO transformed its command structure, including the creation of MARCOM in 2012, and most recently the formation of a new Joint Forces Command in Norfolk, Virginia, focused on the Atlantic. As the prime maritime command in the alliance and SAC-UER's principal maritime advisor, MARCOM currently commands 4 maritime groups that maintain a constant at-sea contribution to maritime situation awareness, deterrence, and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area. This year will also see transfer of the chair of the Arctic Council from Iceland to Russia. In this region, we can observe a confluence of political, military, and physical change, with resurgent Russian ambition and increasing militarization as the Arctic Sea ice retreats, creating increased commercial potential for the North Sea route and opening up a potential maritime area of operation that was previously highly restricted. This is further complicated by the rise of China as a direct political and economic competitor to the West and its self-declaration as an Arctic nation. The Arctic, as a trending topic in NATO and amongst the allies, was subject to attention in Secretary-General Stoltenberg's NATO 2030 expert group report, published at the end of the last year. It was raised not in relation to Russia or China, but notably in the section of climate change. In conclusion, I offer this extra from the report to offer the panel a good starting point to consider Arctic challenges and NATO choices. NATO should enhance its situational awareness across the High North and the Arctic. And for the High North that falls within SAC-UER's area of responsibility, should develop a strategy that takes into account broader deterrence and defense plans. This regional strategy should be built in close coordination with and with sensitivity to perspectives of NATO allies that are Arctic littoral states. It should include plans for ensuring freedom of navigation in the High North and adjacent bodies of water, including the North Atlantic, as well as provisions for addressing aggressive moves by state actors. In support of these efforts, the 2011 Alliance Maritime Strategy should be updated to reflect new threats to transatlantic communications and NATO's desire to keep the Arctic High North a region of low tensions. On this note, I would like to thank all of my speakers today for participation and would like to welcome you to the Atlantic Forum's Spring Conference. At this stage, I'm going to open the floor to open remarks. Professor Lantine, would you like to take the floor first?
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to give my thanks to all of the organizers for this sending greetings from the Arctic Circle. Being in Tromsø certainly gives one a very interesting vantage point when it comes to affairs in the Arctic for a variety of reasons. But I think the two that are most relevant to our conversation today is, first of all, Tromsø hosts the Secretariat for the Arctic Council, which, as was noted, is going to be having a very significant ministerial meeting next month, whereby the chair position is going to be given from Iceland to Russia, and that'll be looked at very closely. So the subject of Arctic cooperation is not too far away from conversation around here. But at the same time, we are a relative stone's throw away from the Russian border. So Russian politics is certainly not far away from political dialogue here either. Now, talking about Arctic security, there has been kind of the general view that the Arctic for a very long time was an area of exceptionalism, that traditional security tended to end when the Arctic Circle began. And that would be the subject of a completely different dialogue. But even if one were to argue that there has been a degree of security exceptionalism here, it is certainly not what it used to be. Another discussion that is becoming very prevalent here is that traditional security or military security is back in the Arctic, assuming it ever really left. But what we are seeing now is one of the reasons why we have quite a bit of discussion about Arctic security is the fact that this is a region which is opening up. We are seeing a very significant and sometimes alarming reports about environmental change in this part of the world, including the opening up of the Arctic Ocean to the point where it's been recently suggested that it may be possible to send vessels through the central Arctic in the summer months as early as 15 years from now. So this is one reason why the Arctic Ocean is starting to be looked at very significantly, not only as an economic concern, but a security one as well. I would also add, though, that in addition to the question of whether hard security is returning to the region, this is also joined, if you will, with another aspect of the fact that there are many non-Arctic actors that are starting to look very seriously at engaging the region. Now, a lot of the dialogue, and this has been the focus of my research, has looked at China. And there has been the tendency in some quarters to say, well, the whole subject of non-Arctic actors in the region, it begins and ends with China, and that is really not the case. You look at several non-Arctic states, United Kingdom, Japan, Germany, France, who have also put out statements and studies that have referred to the Arctic as being of great economic and at times strategic importance. The number of non-Arctic governments in the Arctic Council currently stands at 13, with Switzerland being the most recent. But others, including Estonia, Ireland, and Czech Republic, are seeking observer status this year. So the other major question when talking about security in the region is the balance between the interests of Arctic and non-Arctic states. Where a lot of the discussion is happening here, again, because of our close proximity to Russia, has been the emergence of shipping routes that have started to develop in the Arctic. And the one that gets most of the attention here is the so-called Polar Silk Road, which has been developed over the past 4 years between China and Russia. Both powers are very anxious to see this particular route become a secondary conduit, if you will, for global trade. And certainly Russia is placing a great deal of economic weight on it. Russia has made very little secret, especially over the past few years, that it sees the Arctic as a major area of economic importance. And that, Moscow has traditionally pointed out, is the reason why there's been such a focus on securitizing the region. Then you run into the defensive versus offensive approach. Russia's movement of military material into the region has certainly caused a response in NATO and the United States. You have Russia's response saying, well, this is simply a question of protecting our emerging assets. The issues that have come up recently, though, including reports that came out this week over a new torpedo system that Russia wishes to deploy to the region, has certainly caught the attention of policymakers here in Norway, but has further kind of forced the question of whether we are talking about offensive versus defensive behavior. In the case of China, you have a country that is seeking a great deal of regional legitimacy. It has no geography in the Arctic. That is not going to change. It has nonetheless, over the past 10 years, pursued a policy of so-called Shinbeiji Guojia, near Arctic state, which may be considered a geographical kind of attempt to kind of turn the page a bit, but it also reflects China's great power status and considerable interest in being a partner for Arctic development. This, of course, has gotten quite a bit of concern from the United States and NATO. And the United States, just over the past few months, has attempted to rework its Arctic policy after 4 years of, to put it very diplomatically, some difficulty. There's going to be a challenge now for the United States and NATO to seek to better balance the so-called traditional security concerns, those that have to do with power politics and military security, and other areas of security which are still very much there. They haven't gone away. And I'm talking about human security, development, and the environment. So trying to balance all of this is what is making the question of Arctic security that much more prevalent. But this is taking place at a time where the Arctic is now seen as a much more international space, and certainly not restricted to simply 8 players or the same number of small groups as existed before. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your opening remarks, Mark. It's really good to hear that we are doing some, maybe observing what's happening in the region. So hopefully we'll be able to address it timely and to avoid any complications in the region. Abby, would you like to take it from more of a STEM background?
Yeah, that sounds good. And thank you again for the invitation to participate in this discussion. I definitely perspective of noting that there are many types of security that are relevant to the Arctic, and that there is some balance among them that needs to be achieved. So I'll use that as a nice launching point into my opening remarks here. So understanding how the Arctic maritime security environment is evolving, I think really requires stepping back and considering which factors are driving change in the region and what the interplay among these is. So I think importantly for this discussion, we need to consider how the different factors at play are influencing surface maritime access, but not just the, say, physical ability to access the region. There are different definitions of access as there are different definitions of security or different flavors of security, but also the changes and drivers of change are influencing the types of activities that are occurring in the region. So at the macro level, drivers of change, I'm thinking about things like, of course, geopolitics, but also economics, and there's very many different types of economic issues that we hear, resources and other things, of course. Then there are technologies, certainly technology ranging from say deep sea drilling technology, icebreaking technology, communications technologies, and things like this. Certainly, climate and the physical environment, which is often used as a launching point for these types of discussions. But I think it's important to think about the total drivers of change in the region and not just one. The regulatory environment is critical in the Arctic region, and I think the importance of law enforcement in the maritime environment, for example, is a really important aspect of security as well. And then, of course, any number of social and demographic changes and issues. So these don't all Arctic change. And I like to differentiate these drivers at least into two buckets, if you will. The first bucket is drivers of change that basically raise or lower the cost of doing business in the Arctic. And when I say business, I don't necessarily just mean economic business, but any sort of operating in the region or presence in the region, because they promote, restrict, or control access there. And of course, climate change and its effects is principal among these. It has, in the maritime environment, certainly lowered the barriers for physical access, do so. But I should note too that the impacts of climate change on the Arctic don't always move access in the same direction. So if we looked at that same question on land, we'd see in some cases for impacts of permafrost changes on physical infrastructure stability and winter road seasons and things like that. That's a very different direction of effect, of course. So complex impacts of climate on the physical environment in the Arctic, but of course in the maritime domain, increasing the level of access, generally speaking, and broadening it to more actors. Other forces that shape this access certainly include technological advances, which I already mentioned a few examples, but we might also consider things like the role of automation, the role of like the miniaturization of power sources and things like this. But military posture and operations, and then conventions and other laws are really important for controlling this level of access in the maritime Arctic as well. I mentioned the other bucket is there as well for these drivers of change, and that those would be drivers that don't necessarily promote or restrict access, as it were, but they shape the activities in the Arctic by either encouraging or discouraging certain types of activity. And there's some overlap between these two buckets, but Certainly, geopolitical security do have some role here, but other examples might be things like the economic viability of different types of resources, and certainly some of the as we look forward to thinking through how successful different climate change mitigation measures will be and the impacts there, and also things like indigenous community autonomy and how variable that is across the Arctic, because it's not the same everywhere, and nor does every driver of change impact the Arctic the same way in every part of the Arctic. There are many different Arctics that we have to consider here. So in the near term, I think the interplay of these drivers that I've been talking about raise important considerations for maritime security. And in particular, I wish to draw your attention to two types of challenges. The first one is the challenge of unintended consequences, where growth in maritime activity in the Arctic increases the likelihood of unplanned events, which could include military encounters or discrete events that grow into something larger than how they began, especially as they pull in broader or extra-regional security issues. Back to the question of is the Arctic exceptionalism and whether that's changing or not. And then the other near-term issue is that of a real or perceived security void in the region that would then invite additional military or other types of hard security activity in the region, perhaps by countries that are that do not have Arctic geography. So these issues would, if you will represent, in one instance it's too much Arctic security, and in one instance it might be too little. Looking at the balance of those two and where the right middle course is, I think is important. To wrap things up, and I hope we can talk more about these issues in the discussion of upcoming. But change isn't just something that is happening to the Arctic with no ability to influence it. Governance has a really important role in shaping the demand for Arctic access, and also the ability to access the region, the activities that go on there, and the needs for maritime security, and of what type of needs. Continuing to participate together in international fora, such as the Arctic Council, International Maritime Organization, other forums where you have decision-making capability is very important. And enabling governance requires capability of the right types. So this is not just one investment in icebreakers or other types of assets. This involves investments too in domain awareness, as we heard about at the very beginning, how important that is. But even if we look at non-material, if you will, capabilities, investments also include partnerships and vehicles for cooperation. And I will end it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abby. I'm really looking forward to discussing these notions further as the discussion develops, essentially. Philip, would you like to take the floor from, say, legal maritime security perspective as well?
Of course. Thank you, Petra, for your introduction and for your kind invitation for this fantastic event. Also, thank you very much for all the organizers for entertaining us throughout this weekend. The Arctic is a remarkable region of the world in every aspect, both in terms of geology and wildlife and natural sciences, but also in terms of geopolitics and its unique legal governance system. Mr. Lantain has already introduced us to this system in a quite comprehensive way, but this Arctic Council system was setting aside all the jurisdiction issues in the Arctic aside, was successful in day-to-day administration in the region, passing various agreements on environmental protection, on search and rescue activities, and so on and so forth. So this Arctic exceptionalism, which lasted in the region for at least last 20 years, is crumbling as we speak, due to climate changes and the Arctic becoming more and more significant in global economy and security. This situation caused, of course, national actors, most notably China and Russia, to intensify their activities in the region. And while Chinese focus largely on scientific installations and business in the region, which may act as a political leverage in more distant future, Russia is already directly preparing for exploitation of the Arctic by modernizing its icebreaker fleet and by modernizing of its both military and civilian infrastructure in the region. The recent commission of the largest nuclear-powered icebreaker in the world, the Arctica, as well as military drills in the region, which are made specifically to draw attention of worldwide community, are one of the main reasons that for Arctic to appear in Western media. This raises the question whether NATO, which currently has no permanent Arctic policy and limits itself mostly to regular exercises in the north, should intervene in this region. Even NATO allies do not see eye to eye in this regard, with some countries relying on more national activities, and most commonly the two countries that are given as an example of two opposing stances to NATO activities in the Arctic are Canada, which is which relies more on national competences, and Norway, which is happy to accept larger NATO investment and activities in the region. Sometimes it is also underlined that we need to somehow limit the activities of NATO in future in order to avoid escalation of the conflict with Russia there. However, the increased human activity in the Arctic in all kinds of aspects makes it necessary for NATO to enhance its high north activities, not only to counter one or another state and its activities there, but also to provide security to these activities in the region. Shipping, fishery, and mining in the high north may easily fall victim to hybrid and conventional activities of state and non-state actors, which can in turn result in danger to economic and energetic security of NATO allies. It can also lead to ecological disasters or to dangerous situations mentioned by Ms. Tingstad, which will result in misunderstandings and tensions between states if something occurs in the Arctic maritime lines. Enhanced activities are also creating dangers to the regional ecosystem, and all of those threats needs to be addressed by NATO if NATO wants to remain an adaptive modern alliance as it tries to be, as it appears to be in the NATO 2030 policy. As Mr. Hoevenagel remarked in his opening keynote on Friday, we must do what it takes to address challenges that may arise even 20 years from now on. And even though at this point it may seem that it would be superfluous for NATO to be more active in Arctic, in 20 years from now, Arctic will be a completely different place. So it is the high time to start preparations for what we can expect in the Arctic. The first thing that we need to do is to act within the alliance. Firstly, by building social understanding for the Arctic matters, and secondly, by building a joint cohesive answer of the alliance to Arctic challenges. As NATO youth delegate of Poland, I spend a lot of time meeting with young people in my country, and I also currently conduct a poll among young Poles on their perception of NATO and security of Europe. And the Arctic realm really is completely absent in these discussions. Even though young people across Europe are very keen on climate change issues and are happy to engage in these problems, it's really hard for many people to see the link between our regional security and environmental security and what is going on in the Arctic. This allows me to see with my own eyes that a lot needs to be done for our societies to understand both relevance and complexity of this region. This is important both as a means to enhance resilience of our societies and to create a democratic support that will allow us to act on a larger scale in the Arctic. Because of course, if there is no understanding across the Europe of the relevance of Arctic, then it might be difficult to organize any kind of larger investments or infrastructure in the Arctic. At the same time, NATO and its allies must work together to overcome differences arising between the allies in the Arctic. These are often minor in practice and relate to particular islands that bear little to none military significance, but they will stand in the way of the alliance being an effective and credible actor in the region. Only if these two goals are achieved will we be able to act in the Arctic on a larger scale, for example, by creating rotational military presence or by joint procurement of Arctic equipment. At the same time, NATO and its allies will have to strike a balance between military presence and continuous promotion of international cooperation. as the most beneficial solution for all parties involved, not only the Western states, but also for Russia and China. So I look forward to discuss the shape of these actions with you today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this extensive approach. And I'm really happy to hear that this debate about the Arctic has not been, unfortunately, yet that much represented within the young professionals or community in general, but hopefully we'll be able to give a platform and to start a movement of a sort when it comes to this particular area. I wanted to build on the couple of remarks Professor Lanzani has made. In one of your works that you published, you were talking about the revenge of realpolitik in the Arctic. Could you present that argument to the rest of our viewers? So in regard to that regional security, how these security concerns, since the region is, as we said, is moving away from that strategic periphery and opening up and becoming, so to say, an international challenge, let's put it that way.
Okay, thank you. The revenge of realpolitik refers to the perception, which the other speakers have noted, that this part of the world has been seen as largely disconnected from what was seen as traditional security discourse, for the reason that it was assumed for a very long time, we could go back to the early 90s, immediate post-Cold War, that the cost-benefit ratio made it much more possible, much more congenial for the various powers in the region to look for ways to cooperate rather than to compete. And that for any one actor inside or outside of the region to engage in a revisionist fashion would simply incur too much difficulty. Now that perception, and again, we can debate this at length as to whether or not that situation actually truly existed, is certainly starting to shift quite a bit, both because of the fact that the Arctic is seen as opening up to a great deal of new and potential economic activity. Shipping is one area, extractive industries is another. There's been quite a bit of discussion about various other sectors relating from fishing to tourism. And that certainly has created a perception that these resources, especially in the area of energy and raw materials, could be subject to expanded competition. So the idea of, first of all, ownership and the idea of overall protecting assets has started to become much more prevalent in the discourse. But also the introduction of non-Arctic actors, again, China leading the way, but certainly not the only one. And the idea that with the opening up of the region, economic opportunities should be available to many actors around the world, not just the Arctic themselves, has raised the subject of these kinds of tensions. The idea that we are seeing the great potential for militarization in the region. However, I would not go as far as to argue that we are on the cusp of some kind of scramble or on the cusp of some kind of massive competition, because first of all, if I were to go back, let's say pre-2013 or so, I think the opportunity for a scramble was much greater. Oil was running at much higher prices. There was the idea that economic opportunities were plentiful. But at the same time, a lot of that oil and gas is well within the EEZs of the Arctic states. And now, with the global economy being a little bit more uncertain, the possibility of this kind of scramble has, I wouldn't say gone, but it has certainly slowed down. Nevertheless, we are starting to see a great deal of emphasis by many of the major actors in the region, including the United States and Russia, towards looking at the region from a more geostrategic viewpoint. And the concern that I have is that this is going to lead to more zero-sum thinking, the idea that if X is not pursued by us, it will be pursued by others. So this kind of reflects the idea that realpolitik is back, either actually or figuratively, and the fact that we are now starting to see kind of diversification of how one defines Arctic security.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that one. If I can build, since you touched upon the whole issue with the current economy, especially after in the aftermath of COVID that has happened, do you think that once we come back from this whole recession that is happening at this stage, and if we manage to bring the economies relative to the game that they were before, on the level they were before, do you think that that could potentially re-spark the interest and potentially that scramble for the Arctic?
I guess much will just kind of hedge my bets a bit. I would say that a lot depends on what kind of recovery we're talking about. There's been all kinds of discussion about if the situation improves greatly over the next few months, and I very much hope that is the case. The potential for a V-shaped recovery is very strong, and that will require a very sudden increase in energy demand. Certainly, you look at some of the major Arctic players, and I look especially to Russia, they are certainly making that gamble that the need not only for energy, but also for shipping is going to increase dramatically over the next year, and they are trying to prepare accordingly. It's a similar situation here in Norway. There are certainly discussions about opening up new blocks in the waters north of here for new oil exploration on the idea that demand is going to go up. And other parts of the Arctic are looking forward to more tourism. So we're certainly seeing a little bit of preparation going on. But the problem, though, is if we start to see that very sudden increase, that is going to place strains on several other aspects of Arctic security, especially in regards to the environment. And going back to Russia, for all of Russia's very ambitious Arctic development plans, it got a very nasty wake-up call a few months ago in the case of Norilsk. So this is certainly not a case of, well, we'll only look at some areas of security and development and not others. It is all intertwined.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those remarks. If we can stay on this rough idea, building on yesterday's panel on LAWFAR, when Munoz Mosquera and the rest of his team have touched upon the idea of that covert, so to say, hybrid warfare within the area. Philip, do you think that there is an evolving significance of a naval domain for NATO, considering that we have that kind of covert Arctic scramble when it comes to the LAWFAR perspective? Sorry, I think you muted.
Could you repeat the question, please? Because I had some sound problems and didn't hear it quite well.
Yes, of course. So if we're building on yesterday's panel on LAWFAR and hybrid warfare, would you say that we are currently in that covert Arctic scramble from that legal perspective, based on the discussion we've had yesterday with the SHAPE LAWFAR team?
I would say that this covert Arctic scramble has been going on for some time now, because if we look at how complex this Arctic legal landscape is, and how long were the tensions and disputes on sizes of economic zones and continental shelves in the region, we might see that some activities in this aspect were already done here. When we're talking about LAWFAR, there is a lot to do in this region, because we don't have a unilateral single treaty that would govern this area. We have United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. We have the Arctic Council based on Ottawa Declaration, but the Arctic Council has a rather weak legal foundation. That's just it's based solely on a declaration, so it's fairly easy to ruin its works. It's based solely on goodwill of its participants. So any country that would like to go forward with the scramble for Arctic has many legal tools to work on it. For example, you can see, for example, that many of Russian military exercises and military displays of power revolve around the Lomonosov Ridge. That's one of the most prominent cases of a dispute, of a territorial dispute in the Arctic, because the Lomonosov Ridge lies exactly under the North Pole, or above the North Pole, and it is a piece of debate between Denmark and Russia, because as we are talking about continental shelf, it needs to have a connection to the continental shelf of the country that wants to acquire it, and there is a constant debate, which is more scientific than legal, about whether the Lomonosov Ridge is is an underwater prolongation of Greenland or a part of Russian continental shelf. So this is just one of the examples that all of these things mix in the Arctic. We have this legal problem of the borders of the continental shelf. We have activities of Russia in the region, including military activities and some kind of narrative on Arctic being a historical and cultural part of Russia. So certainly this field of uncertainty, legal uncertainty in the Arctic, definitely gives a good grounds for state and non-state actors to resort to lawfare and other hybrid measures in this area. The best way, of course, to tackle these issues would be to create some kind of coherent response by Arctic countries belonging to NATO, because we know that we have some disputes between NATO countries, ranging from the less serious, like the Hans Island between Denmark and Canada, which is more of a friendly quarrel than a serious international dispute, to the disputes revolving on Canadian northern seaway, which is considered an internal waters by Canada and international passage by the United States. So existence of such disputes between allies within NATO is a big issue for building of any kind of answer from NATO perspective, because you can't really build any coherent answer to disputes and to law tricks used by actors there if there are legal disputes arising within the allies. So definitely lawfare is something that is very much present in the Arctic, and in order to tackle it, we first have to tackle the differences arising between NATO states.
Thank you so much for this interesting answer. And as we said before, we always have that bit of a struggle when it comes to the NATO, because we have to have a consensus vote on everything. And different member states, different allies and partners, they have different views and different priorities set out. And for some reason, Arctic is still too far out from that kind of encompassing debate to it. But talking about all of these so-say loopholes and gaps that we are currently facing in this theater as we are. Abby, in your testimony, you said that there is no one type of mobile asset, fixed infrastructure, organization, collaboration, or other entity that could satisfy every potential gap that we are facing, essentially, within this area. Could you elaborate what kind of toolbox, in a way, could assist the Alliance to fill these gaps that we are looking into when it comes to Arctic in particular?
Yeah, happy to look at that question. I should preface my remarks by saying that the research that my colleagues and I have done have focused on the U.S. Coast Guard, and so I'm speaking from that perspective, not for all of NATO. Though I suspect that the discussion it would be pretty similar. So the point there was that I think oftentimes there's a focus of what do we need to operate in the Arctic? What do we need to do law enforcement? What do we need to have security of all the various types that we've been talking about? Is to focus on a certain small number of very visible assets like icebreakers, and then suddenly say, okay, we've got a gap here. Let's go fix that. And I think for us in our research, it was concerning that at least for the U.S. Coast Guard, a lot of discussion had turned into almost like there's an icebreaker gap. And so what we wanted in our research when we demonstrated was that it's more than an icebreaker gap. So if you purchase a few more icebreakers, that is certainly helpful for presence in the region. But let's bear in mind that they're not a silver bullet. They don't do everything. And so every time we look at what's needed to operate in the Arctic, we emphasize that, of course, there's a lot of different types of ships and helicopters, aircraft, and certainly not even to get into different vehicles that might be needed in order to access remote places, or in some cases dog sleds. There's all sorts of things for access. But then oftentimes there's this hidden connective tissue in the communications and remote sensing of the region, especially because it's so vast, and the physics of the region are somewhat in some cases very different than the rest of the globe. So the solutions that work at lower latitudes don't work always in the Arctic. And I think sometimes that more hidden connective tissue sometimes gets missed in conversations and discussions on this issue. So we wanted to highlight that. And then furthermore, all of the, and this perhaps gets into more of a NATO perspective here, but not the solutions necessarily point towards new technological investments. As I spoke about before, there's certainly a need for partners to operate in the Arctic region, and different forms of collaboration and things like this. So training of personnel as another example. So to not focus too narrowly on purchasing a few more ships and calling it a day and saying that everything is going to work out.
Yeah, it's not just about that kind of capital aspect that we have in technology. It's about the memberships and partnerships that we are creating and bonds when it comes to the influence to it. But if we build on that one, looking into the potential partnerships to enhance the Arctic maritime security, where do you think the Alliance should look at to find the best partnerships for this particular region? I'm leaving this one open to all three of you, depending who wants to pick up that one. Abby, would you like to go with that one?
Sure. I'll say a few general remarks, but since I haven't studied NATO writ large, I don't want to speak definitively on it. So perhaps the other speakers will have something to add here. But I think as we strategize and plan moving forward, I think there's a real need to assess essentially an inventory of what each partner could bring to bear in the region and how that might be used to support the Alliance's goals. And I think understanding what capabilities are available and how they could connect it together. And I mean that not only from an operational standpoint and having a plan, but also in terms of communication and being able to share data. Again, sometimes these connective problems of literally communicating and also the policies that guide information sharing can get in the way of effective partnerships anywhere in the world. And just given how many countries have relatively few capabilities that will also work in the Arctic harsh environment, and also considering the very broad and vastness of the region, it becomes even more important to really think about how to use everything that is available to the fullest.
Thank you so much. Dr. Valentine, would you like to take next?
I would say just 2 quick points. First of all, we're certainly seeing a little bit of catch-up, which is starting to be observed when it comes to various areas of cooperation as a result of the very rapid opening up of the Arctic. And we're seeing this, for example, by the fact, going back to the Northern Sea Route, that the traditional rule of thumb was that these kinds of transits were only possible in the summer, but now we're seeing experimental transits as early as February. We're starting to see a lot of concern for what this means in regards to civilian vessels. The Polar Code from 2017 was a method to kind of address that. But I would also say the second point is this is an area where the Arctic opening up as an international space, not necessarily in terms of law, but rather in terms of the need for a new set of guidelines and potential for cooperation, because of the fact that we are going to be seeing very soon a time where more and more of the Central Arctic will become open. A fishing moratorium is already in place, so that's a step in the right direction, but several countries, including in its Arctic White Paper, have already started to make preparations for transits of the Central Arctic. So definitely things are heading in a very good direction in regards to the potential for cooperation, but the time frame is still very uncertain.
Thank you so much. Philip, the floor is yours.
I fully support Ms. Tingstad also that the icebreaker fleet is not a silver bullet, and it's not something that we can use as an excuse for anything. Like we are building icebreakers, so the Arctic issue is resolved, because we know that to launch new capabilities in the Arctic and to really deliver on what we are expecting in the coming years in the Arctic. So enhanced maritime traffic and perhaps location of critical infrastructure in the region. We have to organize more and more assets. Breakers are just the most prominent part of this, and like they can act like the PR part of this, the most prominent and the most visible in the media. But we need to address a lot of issues together with our partners. This may include stronger communication infrastructure. So something that relies solely upon the Arctic states and the way they can provide in the Arctic. Unmanned patrol vehicles that are tailored to operate in difficult conditions, such as Danish Thetis-class patrol vessels, which are not necessarily very capable as the warships, because they're using mostly artillery equipment. But they have limited ice-breaking capabilities and search and rescue capabilities, so they are ready to perform a wide array of duties. So both our partners and we must look at such solutions that are tailored to the Arctic needs, but also not necessary, but also can be used elsewhere, because the Thetis-class patrol vessels is also a very capable patrol vessel in itself. So it could theoretically be used in other parts of the world. When I was discussing the possible frameworks for NATO cooperation in my Atlantica paper, I made remarks about two such possible frameworks of cooperation. The one is, once again, the icebreakers, but I think it would be a feasible idea for NATO to build a icebreaker fleet in the same manner as we build the AWACS fleet or the fleet of heavy cargo airlift aircraft. This would allow us to build this icebreaker fleet quicker and end this topic of icebreaker gap for good, and also to manifest rights and interests of other countries that are not capable of providing capabilities that are tailored for Arctic. Because, for example, if you look at smaller countries with smaller navies, or southern countries that probably won't find a tailored Arctic patrol vessel or Arctic icebreaker, if they make a joint procurement, just like they do with the heavy airlift or AWACS, they may be able to manifest their interest in this way. So this would be a good way to engage all NATO partners in this Arctic activities. Also, another way in which we could build partnerships around the Arctic would be a unit. This would provide us with much needed search and rescue capabilities, which will definitely be in hand when shipping increases in the Arctic. Because right now we have this search and rescue agreement between the Arctic states, but this is obviously not ready for increase in maritime shipping. So perhaps at one point we will need to make a multinational search and rescue force that will arrive in the Arctic and mark presence of the alliance in the region in a way that is also not overtly aggressive from perspective of other actors. And this would also grant new capabilities to states that are not in the Arctic, but they may regardless benefit from receiving such expertise in working in harsh winter conditions. So we have to address both problems in lacks of capabilities that arise in, which can be really addressed by NATO. But also we must find some ways to cooperate, all parties, all interested NATO countries to cooperate in the Arctic.
There is echo I can hear. Can you hear me all clear? Sorry, there was some echo on my side then. So we're basically building on the idea of, I think you also presented that one in your article on the Joint Arctic Command, to have that structured approach to it and that kind of joint defense investments happening with allies and partners within the region, right?
Yeah.
Wonderful. We got a question coming up from Terry Schultz. She is, I hope it's a she. I hope I haven't messed this one up. I'm sorry if I have. Independent journalist for Brussels Barents Observer. The question goes, Russia's Northern Fleet now in Norwegian Sea to ensure fishermen's safety, under quotation marks. Only the tug and the tanker will have AIS turned on. Is that concerning? Who would like to take that one? So we're looking into the fishermen's safety, and the tug and tanker will only have the AIS turned on. Would that be concerning from our perspectives?
Do you think we could post the question in the way that's visible to us? Because I'll be honest, I may not be understanding the question, but if I can help answer it, I'd be glad to, but I don't think I fully understood.
No problem. We're going to ask for clarification. Terry, if you can just send us a quick explanation to the chat box, and then we're going to get back to it once we have a clearer picture on it. On that note, we're going to be moving on to a different aspect that I wanted to discuss with you. So if we're looking into the cooperation between EU and NATO as partners within the region, so how would you see those two institutions addressing the increasing importance of the maritime security and the security in general within the Arctic in a collaborative manner?
I can start if that's all right.
Yeah, by all means.
Well, I can, just to give a bit of background. Now, the European Union is obviously extremely active in Arctic affairs on several fronts. It has been a frequent participant in Arctic Council affairs. Several EU members are observers or members of the Arctic Council. So what the European Union has been seeking to do, and there's been a lot of very interesting documentation, is to build a more multifaceted approach to Arctic affairs. And one priority for Brussels has been a greater cooperation with NATO, understanding that security concerns in the Arctic are starting to become much more prevalent. But I would say that there still needs to be a little bit more clarification, going back to our original topics of security, as to what areas of security are going to be the priority for the EU in the near future, especially because, and I go back to this frequently, we are dealing with a very fluid situation.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Valentine. Abby, Philip, would you like to comment on this one?
I think my fellow panelists are probably better positioned to comment, so I will pass on this one.
By all means, you have a full right to do so. Philip, the floor is yours.
Of course, with pleasure. The current EU policy in the Arctic is based on a joint communication of the Commission from 2016, and it puts particular emphasis on these very aspects of fostering international cooperation, responding to impact of climate change, and contribution to sustainable development that we mentioned earlier. So I think that looking at how EU does an amazing job in facilitating cooperation between Arctic countries, in terms of pollution reductions or joint research, I think that the EU has an important political role to fulfill in the Arctic. Please keep in mind that the EU is a de facto permanent observer of the Arctic Council. It is also a member of the Barents Euro-Arctic Council, which is a forum similar to the Arctic Council in terms of dealing with more or less the same issues: search and rescue, cooperation in maritime environment security, and pollution reductions, but on a local Barents Sea scale. So I believe that the EU is even more suited politically than NATO to fulfill the role of this one agent that promotes international cooperation. So I think I think the cooperation between NATO and the EU may take this dualist approach of NATO providing some serious capabilities in the region, and the EU fostering international cooperation. as it is often discussed, the NATO and its activities may somehow shift the balance of powers in the region and put Russia on alert. But I think that this double-sided approach to these issues might be very profitable if NATO uses its experiences in terms of expanding military capabilities and defense capabilities in wider perspective, and the EU uses its political experience in the Arctic. I also think that in the future, depending on how our relations might develop in the Arctic and how the situation might develop, I think that Europe, with its expanding defense agenda, may also participate in various NATO activities in the Arctic. For example, the Frontex is still expanding, and we can imagine that at some point it will also participate in NATO-led activities if such activities take place in the Arctic. So I think that the cooperation between NATO and the EU is very promising in this regard, and I think that they both should use their best experiences to create a holistic approach to the region.
Thank you so much. As we discussed in the introduction as well, when it comes to the Arctic, we truly need a holistic approach to deal with the region. As we said, it's not just the economy as it seemed to be like a decade ago, but it's much more than that. It's like multi-layered. It's kind of a hydra. It goes everywhere. We have got a clarification. So Terry is referring to an article that was published today in the Barents Observer that was covering that for the first time Russian Northern Fleet is tasked to serve fishing vessels in waters that are part of the Norway's economic zone, and asking us, would that be something concerning for us as the alliance, and what were our views on this one as a panel?
I would like to address it first, if it's okay with you.
By all means, go, Philip.
Of course, this is alarming, particularly from the national Norwegian perspective that the warships are present there. But on the other hand, when we are evaluating any kind of Russian activity in the region, we must keep in mind that to some extent, all of their activities have the goal to also impress their national public. And this is also done largely to impress the internal public and to sow fear around its neighbors and to show off that we are a global power and we can send a frigate to Norwegian exclusive economic zone and because we are very present there. So when we are looking at such activities of Russia, we don't have to panic. It's not like this is a decisive factor in our relations in the Arctic. Because we have to take into consideration that many of these are merely a publicity stunts. We saw the recent surfacing of 3 nuclear-powered submarines near the North Pole during the UMCA-21 exercise. This was also made to look visually striking. A few days later, there was an exercise of land forces, Russian in the Arctic, and there was a leakage of material where there was a military transporter somewhere in the Arctic with some kind of inscription reading that Alaska is coming home just like Arctic is coming home. Of course, from a security perspective, this is ridiculous, but it was made as a manifest of power. So we don't necessarily have to take this very seriously because this is to a large extent a publicity stunt, but of course, it doesn't negate the fact that Russia is a challenge in the region.
Thank you so much for that remark. Because I mean, as you said, it's not something. It's a lot of publicity when it comes, and a lot of domestic policies involved in these kind of acts that are happening on international scale, projected in international scale. But also, it does kind of ring the bell. It has a familiar taste in a way. And also, if we look into the fact that was it, I think last week, we've had NATO fighter jets being scrambled from both Norwegian and Belgian side, from the Benelux area, and then the UK later on because of the flight classes. If we also look into those, there was one bizarre event in May. I don't remember when exactly, but it was that kind of springish time, when we had a beluga whale that was wearing that Russian-made harness. It is a lot of, it kind of has a really familiar Little Green Man feeling to it, a little bit of Little Wood Choppers on the Korean border back in the 20th century. It's a lot of, it's familiar, but as you said, it's not something to necessarily panic, but be cautious about, I'd say.
I think that when we are comparing, just a little point on this. I think when we are comparing the Arctic issues with with what happened in the Ukraine, for example, or on Russian influence on the Belarus, we have to keep in mind that in the former Soviet republics, this is a zero-sum game. They have to manifest some kind of presence and some kind of pressure on these countries to show off. But in the Arctic, the situation is different because it's actually Russia actually benefits from this area being a low tension zone. We have to keep in mind that it doesn't necessarily, it's not in their best interest to conquer the Arctic. It's in their best interest to make Arctic a safe and viable transit route so that they can benefit from the naval traffic. So it's not like they're going to war over the Arctic, because ultimately it's to their benefit to leave the area peaceful.
I guess I would just briefly add to emphasize that we must look at these types of actions in context. And we did talk a little bit about domestic policies. In our research, we did find that in a number of cases with Russian activity in the Arctic of this sort of type, is that there's definitely a domestic political reason for doing some of these things, perhaps a media reason as well. So it's important to look at that in context. And I would say that importantly, to me, it is true that in the Arctic, the countries and stakeholders have historically benefited from playing by the rules, because it creates a better situation for everyone to achieve their goals. But as we move forward, I think it's right to look at these questions of who's making the rules, and how are these rules being further developed as climate change and other issues come up for security. What areas need to be re-looked at, and those who have a seat at the table to make the rules are then in a position of power. And we've mentioned the Polar Code already, but one of the really interesting things I think about the Polar Code is just that it was created under the auspices, of course, of the International Maritime Organization, which of course has a much more global set of stakeholders that are involved with that than say does the decision-making power of the Arctic Council, to include China, of course.
Wonderful. Donatella, I think you had a comment as well on this one.
Yes, just to quickly add, certainly if you were to look at what's been happening here, I can certainly identify a pattern of Russia seeking to, shall we say, test the boundaries a little bit of some areas of Arctic rules and norms. There's a new research group which started here at the university called the Gray Zone, and it deals with these kinds of issues, this kind of in-between type activity. Like, I'm hearkening back to, we've seen Russia begin to challenge Norwegian policy in Svalbard more than once. So on one hand, there's been all the discussion about Russia, I should say, setting up new or reopening old Cold War bases in Siberia, and that gets a lot of attention. But it's activities like this that I think are certainly also worthy of discussion. And again, a lot of it certainly could fall under the category of swaggering or showing the flag. But even if that were to be the case completely, it is certainly going to create a response in Norway and other parts of NATO to say, okay, we need to start responding to this a little bit more concretely. So we go back to the problem of the security dilemma, that even if we are talking about posturing, it could invite a response which could further complicate the military security situation in the Arctic as a whole.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all the remarks. I hope that on this note, we can put this one to rest for the time being, unless there's another beluga whale floating around. But what I wanted to ask you, we talked a lot about Russia, but obviously we mentioned China as being one of the big actors to it. And considering the bromance that is currently, as Mr. Jamie Shea mentioned on Friday, between Russia and China is currently happening. In your views, especially you, Dr. Lantain, because this is predominantly your area, how do you see this bromance essentially portraying and happening in the Arctic? Would that be something of our concern, and what is your overall view on the China's role in the Arctic?
Thank you. It's interesting. The discussion over whether a Sino-Russian partnership in the Arctic is starting to deepen. It's a very serious one. And certainly we are starting to see greater occurrences of cooperation in the region. For example, PLA forces were present during the Vostok 2018 maneuvers. And certainly there is greater discussion about further cooperation in areas such as scientific exploration of the Arctic and some areas related to economics. I can point to the liquefied natural gas project in Yamal. That said, I still tend to be a little bit of a skeptic towards the idea of either a serious alliance or a bromance or however you want to call it, simply because we are talking about two countries, first of all, which arguably are on different power trajectories, but also the fact that their approach to the Arctic is considerably different. Russia has put a great deal of emphasis on maintaining the sanctity of Arctic sovereignty and has made it very clear that while Russia is very happy to get assistance from China or from any other outside non-Arctic country in developing its resources in Siberia and Northern Sea Route and so forth, Moscow has made it very clear that we are the Arctic states and non-Arctic states are in a completely different category. China, on the other hand, is wanting to be accepted as an Arctic stakeholder. And Russia, at the moment, is the only Arctic player that has really developed this kind of deepening relationship with China economically in the region. And China is also very well aware that a lot of its outlets to the Arctic, literally and figuratively, do go through Russia. So I would say that this partnership, once you go down a few layers, I'm not completely sure that we're seeing the level of political cooperation or trust that would be required for that kind of partnership to take place. But a lot is going to have to do with how the United States and NATO approach the region in the near future. This could shift.
Thank you so much for those remarks. Would anybody from the panel like to add to this one? I'm going to take that as a no.
If I may, I agree that the bromance between China and Russia is rather harsh. It's not based on affection. It's more based on equal interests. And you can see that they are competing all over the world. You can see that how they compete for influence in Serbia, for example, where the Chinese vaccine diplomacy is very prominent. And they are slowly pushing away Russian investments from this country, and China becomes more and more the big friend of Serbia instead of Russia, like in the recent years. So this may sound controversial, but I actually believe that the presence of China in the table of countries participating in this Arctic issue could benefit the West in some cases, because it can ease the tensions between NATO and Russia, because as I said, we have some very basic goals that might seem similar at the same time. For example, the freedom of navigation. So it may come to that at a certain point, when Russia wishes to demonstrate its territorial approach and block the Northern Sea Route somehow, or exercise too much influence on this area, then NATO and China will speak in the same way for Russia to exercise pressure on Russia. On the other hand, if China wishes to become more active in a military manner in the Arctic, which is also possible and was already outlined several times in Europe, that they can use the Northern Sea Route to attack shipping in the Atlantic, for example, or the British Isles. We can say that the first country that will be alerted by such unilateral actions by the Chinese Navy will be Russia, because as Professor Lantain said, it is their outlet to the Arctic. So I believe that if this is carefully executed politically, we can actually benefit from Chinese presence in the Arctic. Because the Chinese can exercise some more pressure on Russia than NATO acting on its own.
Thank you so much. There's a bit of an echo again. Okay, we're back online. So we have a question coming from Nico Sigers. So he's asking about the SAR and protection operation at sea pose severe challenges, more so in the Arctic. In case of suspected malign activity, pseudo accident, how to improve evidence collection?
Well, if I may, oh, go ahead.
Sorry.
If I may just briefly, I think this is another example of why improving not only the ability to collect and process and infuse data, but to be able to share it across different stakeholders is so important, because it's hard to do in the Arctic, and it's hard to do when you've got a lot of different stakeholders with different policies about information sharing and different capabilities. But I think this is another example of why that's important to resolve.
Thank you so much. Does anybody want to add on this one by any chance? I'm taking it as a pass. So if we're looking on the general scope, we have like some 10 minutes more left, so I'm going to just kind of drag it more towards the conclusive of our debate and discussion in general. So if we look into the reasons and the key factors that led towards this whole transformation of maritime economy, the sea landscape communication and resources in the Arctic, what do you see as not only NATO 2030, but also, as we discussed before, for like 20 years onwards and forever, essentially? What kind of approach should NATO take today as an alliance, as partners and members, to ensure that this region genuinely does remain the region of high north but low intensity? Mark, would you like to take that one first?
Thank you. I would say, first of all, that it is certainly important now for the region to understand, or for the major actors in the region to understand, just the sheer amount of change that has taken place just over a very, very short time. I could talk about the environmental situation. We are seeing report after report coming out of very different actors and agencies to say exactly what has been happening up here. And the issues of environmental security are certainly not going away, and they definitely need to be factored into any kind of broader discussion, any multilateral discussion about where security in this region is going. And NATO should certainly be a participant, along with the European Union and others, in that dialogue. The other point being, though, is that we are starting to see, just to go back to my original comments, a greater internationalization of the Arctic in regards to which actors are very interested in developing partnerships to take advantage of the economic opportunities which are starting to appear here. I mentioned non-Arctic states before. One actor which I didn't mention, which really kind of underscores the fact that Arctic stakeholders are starting to become much more widely defined. Singapore has been an observer, formal observer in the Arctic Council since 2013. It is very concerned about the possibility of sea level rise, as well as the shipping situation in the Arctic. So the number of countries which need to be engaged when we talk about how best to ensure the high north low tension has certainly become much more prevalent. And the good news is the next Arctic Council ministerial, because of the kind of changing political situation with some of the actors, I'm thinking primarily of the US, the possibility of multilateralism is that much higher. And I think now we are starting to see really the urgency involved in that process.
Thank you so much. Abby, would you like to comment on this one?
Just a few things to emphasize and add. So the Arctic has historically been an opportunity for discussion and diplomacy, and I think it's important to continue to think of it that way and keep the doors and windows open for discussion. And I think in addition to that, the Arctic countries have a track record of anticipating problems before they become essentially something that would raise tensions, because they are so immediately relevant. So the Central Arctic Ocean fishing moratorium is a good example of that. So before something becomes a problem, so to speak, talk about it when the stakes are still relatively low, if you will. Important to plan for, but not an immediate problem to be dealing with right now. So I think continuing to do that, anticipate these problems, and deal with them is something that would be important to continue doing in the future. And you need to have doors open for communication, lines open for communication in order to do so, which of course raises this question again of do we have sufficient forums in which to have these discussions and make these decisions together? And one topic that I don't think that has had a conclusion yet, lots of opinions, of course, but is that of, what's needed to discuss hard security, military security in the Arctic? Is a forum needed? Is a separate forum? Are the forums of the past and some of the existing forums sufficient for that? And I think that's an open question. And whether or not we see a forum for hard security matters in the Arctic is one thing, but the fact that it needs to be discussed, I think, is quite definite.
I'm really happy to hear remarks, and I genuinely hope that this particular panel will, as I said, open up not only for the professionals, as Philip mentioned earlier on, but genuinely to start having more discussions on the topic and engage more people from different backgrounds, just to summon all of us together, coming from be it operational, tactical, political, STEM background, legal, just to see how we can all incorporate all our views and currents that we belong to in the end of the day to genuinely keep the low tension, because as we said, it's not only Russia who benefits from it being low tension, it's the international community as in general. Philip, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I fully agree with what has been said by the previous speakers, but I also would like to once again underline what I was mentioning earlier about the fundamental need for NATO to create a common voice if it wants to be a stakeholder in the Arctic at all. Because at this point, with more and less important disputes at the table, NATO will not have a serious place for discussion. One of the reasons I think why many of such disputes were frozen and are still unsolved is because they were simply irrelevant from the security perspective. Like we do not agree with Canada on the waterways. We do not agree on this island or this island, but we have the Cold War going on. So let's ditch it and let's go for the Cold War, and we'll return it on another time. And this time has come to address those issues, because in a time of, as we discussed together yesterday, the lawfare, many hybrid measures, any kind of minor misunderstanding between the allies can become a big problem. So if we want to address these issues together, we have to address them with a coherent approach. This would also probably include the ratification of the United Convention on the Law of the Sea by the United States, because the United States still haven't ratified it, and from the legal perspective, it's really surprising to see that the United States used the arguments laid out in this convention, for example, meaning the international waterways and the passage through straits, to exercise some certain influence over Russia and Canada. So we have to be credible actors also from this legal standpoint to be taken seriously in the Arctic. So yeah, this is the key to create a coherent approach and to act both to build capabilities and to foster international cooperation in this region as a single bloc.
Well, thank you so much for that remark. As you said, it's genuinely important that we not only share the same standpoint, not only that we are standing in the same position, but that we also abide the same rules and regulations, and we can't really call upon them if we don't sign them. So hopefully that's going to happen sooner rather than later. And on this wonderful note, as much as I know that we have so many more areas to cover, we are unfortunately out of time. But I would like to thank each and every one of you for your time. I know it's Sunday afternoon, and I genuinely appreciate for you taking your time for talking to us all about these pressing topics that might not seem much right now, but I think that Jonathan, you said in one of your things, one of your articles you published, that it came gradually but then suddenly. And I think also I've read it somewhere that two types of Arctic problems: the imaginary and the realistic one. And the out of the two, the imaginary is the most pressing one. So I hope that we're going to stick to the realistic ones, keep the low tension as much as we possibly can, and give more platforms, not only for the young people, but for everybody else to just put all the differences aside and discuss it genuinely to keep it as low as possible. On that wonderful note, thank you again so very much, and I'm hoping you're going to be joining us soon on the next panel, hopefully in person. But until then, do stay safe, and looking forward to catching up with you soon.